NATO is in crisis mode. Why? US President Donald Trump may be on the verge of withdrawing the US from NATO altogether, weakening the collective defense alliance so badly that it may not survive. What can NATO's European members do to keep the organization alive as Trump threatens its very existence? And how do Trump's actions have the potential to weaken NATO so severely? It all started in mid-February 2025. On February 15th, Politico reported that a delegation of senior Trump administration officials was heading to Saudi Arabia for peace talks over the Ukraine war. That meeting would take place a couple of days later and included a trio of Americans alongside 3 Russian delegates. Those Americans were the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff. The latter is an unknown quantity, according to the BBC. However, Witkoff is the man Trump chose to send to Moscow only a week before the meeting to speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin. On the Russian side of the discussion sat 2 of the country's leading diplomats, Russian Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov and the country's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They were joined by Kirill Dmitriev, who heads Russia's Direct Investment Fund. He joined the discussions later when the US and Russia turned their attentions to economic matters moving forward. You may have noticed some strange absences from these Ukraine war peace talks. Nobody from Ukraine went to Saudi Arabia, and apart from the US, NATO had no presence during the meeting. Both were excluded from talks, essentially sidelining them to the point of irrelevance. That meeting was a major shot to NATO's status as a collective defense force. Rather than providing a united front and a collective show of strength, Trump elected to go it alone with his Putin discussions. The aftermath of that meeting has also caused issues for NATO and Ukraine. After Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed his dissatisfaction at not being invited to the talks, Trump said he was disappointed in the response. He also launched a scathing attack against Zelensky, branding him a dictator who has done a terrible job of leading Ukraine. Trump said that Zelensky was refusing to have elections in Ukraine. Though technically true, Zelensky did suspend Ukraine's elections, this claim ignores the fact that Ukraine has been under martial law since Russia invaded in February 2022. Most countries under martial law suspend elections until the issue causing martial law ends, and the Ukraine war hasn't ended. These verbal jabs were worrying from a NATO perspective. They showcase the collective defense organization's most powerful member seeming to conduct an about-face in policy. Rather than supporting Ukraine as the rest of NATO does, the US seemed to be antagonizing Kyiv. Even more worrying for NATO were the reports that the US and Russia used their talks to introduce the idea of a joint Arctic energy project. Politico quotes Dmitriev as claiming these discussions were fairly general, though they included some specific areas of cooperation that the US and Russia could explore. Again, this was a break from NATO policy. Most NATO members, including the US, have levied sanctions against Russia since Putin's invasion. Talk of renewed trade hasn't been on the agenda until Trump called Putin. And now those talks are starting to open up, the rest of NATO will worry because they're not involved in discussions that could affect the security of many of the organization's members. It all adds up to Trump seeming to switch the blame for the Ukraine war from Putin and towards Zelensky. He even said as much himself. Speaking to reporters from his Florida home after the meeting, Trump confronted Zelensky's claims that he was upset over not being invited. "Today I heard, oh well, we weren't invited," Trump exclaimed. "Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years ago. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal." There are several other US actions since that meeting that have also impacted NATO's goal of creating a united front against potential aggressors. For instance, March 4th saw Trump suspend all US military aid to Ukraine in the wake of a contentious meeting he held with Zelensky in the White House. That decision means all shipments that haven't already arrived in Ukraine, including those in transit, will be paused as Trump reassesses America's involvement in the war. A day later, the US also announced that it had instructed its NATO allies not to share any US-generated intelligence with Ukraine. That impacts Ukraine as it loses access to information that helped it to target Russian positions. However, it's also yet another message to NATO. The US is the most important member of this group, and you must all do as America says. Of course, the US has the right to use any intelligence it gathers on any matter as it sees fit. However, this move is yet another example of Trump seeming to move away from the cooperative approach NATO has espoused for as long as it's existed. If Trump is willing to put limits on intelligence, then what comes next? Could he prevent NATO forces from using the logistical network America has created in Europe? Might he pull the 100,000-plus US military personnel stationed on the continent? Right now, nobody in NATO knows. But many of its most prominent members are likely asking those questions. After Trump announced these suspensions, French President Emmanuel Macron called for a meeting with the main military heads of the European Union or EU. The gathering is ongoing at the time of the creating of this video, but we'll likely see those military leaders confront the question of what Trump's decisions mean for both the EU and NATO. This isn't the first time Macron has hosted such a meeting. Just a couple of days before the Trump delegates met Putin's representatives in Saudi Arabia, Macron hosted a group of 11 European leaders in Paris to discuss the war. Among those present were Britain's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte was also present, signaling that any conversation that concerns Europe is also one that needs to involve NATO. We see a clear divide here. The US under Trump pursues its own policies. The rest of NATO, particularly its European members, are uniting to respond to those American policies. This isn't what a collective defense organization is supposed to do. Though each NATO member rightly has its own policies when it comes to internal politics, NATO has generally provided a united front when it comes to issues of war. That's changed under Trump's leadership. But does it mean Trump has killed NATO? It's a little bit premature to talk about the death of NATO, says former NATO political officer and senior fellow at Chatham House, Samantha de Bendern, during a debate over the topic held by France 24. It certainly seems to be weakened. I would say maybe even suffering from an autoimmune disease, because the link that seems to be weakening NATO is coming from within. It's coming from its strongest ally. Therein lies the problem for NATO. Trump's recent actions haven't destroyed the collective defense organization in one fell blow. However, they're chipping away at what makes NATO such a powerful defensive force against large military nations like Russia. And it's not just Trump who's chipping away. Members of his administration have also made it clear that Europe is in America's crosshairs. On February 14th, just days before Trump's delegates met Putin's people in Saudi Arabia, US Vice President J.D. Vance took the stage at the Munich Security Conference. That conference exists for allied nations, predominantly those who are part of or supported by NATO, to discuss defense. Only Vance didn't do that. Instead, he launched what The Guardian called a brutal ideological assault on Europe. That assault included accusations that Europe's leaders suppress free speech, have failed to halt illegal migration, and are running in fear from their voters. "What I worry about is the threat from within," Vance said as he questioned what he called Europe's internal retreat from its most fundamental values. Vance also indicated that the US is pulling away from Europe, which would also mean pulling away from NATO. If you are afraid of the voices, the opinions, and the conscience that guide your very own people, if you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing that America can do for you, nor for that matter, is there anything you can do for the American people. Again, we see a conscious division between America and its NATO allies. The speech by Vice President J.D. Vance in Munich was a very stark departure from the kind of speeches one makes at Munich, says de Bendern. This is also a departure from an unwritten rule in US diplomacy, which is internal politics stay at home. The US does not bring its internal political problems to the outside world and does not criticize the internal political problems or not of its allies. De Bendern also notes that Vance's speech included no mention of the threats facing Europe due to Russia, along with no mention of NATO. It all hints at Europe no longer being a priority for the US. And if there were any doubt about that, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made America's approach clear on February 12th. During his first international trip, where he met many of America's NATO allies, Hegseth said that the US was no longer primarily focused on European security. He told other NATO leaders that he was here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The Guardian notes that this exclamation was toned down from a draft Hegseth created in advance that he used to brief the press. In that draft, Hegseth seemed to suggest recasting the NATO alliance so that Europe bore the brunt of the organization's responsibilities. What's so extraordinary is that on one hand, the United States is saying to Europe, your security is no longer our priority, says de Bendern. And at the same time, it starts meddling inside the internal politics of other European countries. It's kind of Schrodinger's policies. It's neither dead nor alive. That may be what's killing NATO more than anything else. The Trump administration's approach to Europe seems designed to leave the continent in stasis. NATO's European leaders can't move forward with many of their policies without US involvement. That essentially cuts NATO off at the knees by creating a sense of disunity that plays right into Putin's hands. That's something NATO needs to counter, according to former commander of the Estonia Defense Forces, Rio Terras. Speaking to France 24, he explained that the summits being called by European leaders in the wake of Trump's actions need to deliver a clear statement. It's important to make sure that the message coming out of this meeting will be a very unified message that NATO will show resolve and unity, says Terras. The other thing we need to make sure is that Putin believes in NATO, because NATO is only as strong as its enemies take it. That sort of unity is going to be hard to showcase when the biggest NATO member seems to be heading in the opposite direction to the other 31 states of the alliance. Other Trump policies may also impact NATO in the coming months. For example, Trump hinted that he may apply tariffs on the EU on February 3rd. He's already applied a 25% tariff to Canada, another one of America's NATO allies, with the EU suggestion fueled by Trump's dissatisfaction with the bloc. They don't take our cars, they don't take our farm products, they take almost nothing and we take everything from them. Millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products, Trump told journalists in Florida. The BBC then asked if he intended to use tariffs to remedy those issues. Trump replied that there isn't a timeline, but it's going to be pretty soon. A couple of weeks later, Trump expanded on the issue. He claimed that the EU was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it, and they've done a very good job of it. But now I'm president. A February 27th Kiel Institute analysis of what Trump's threatened 25% tariffs could mean spells bad news for the EU and, by extension, America's NATO allies. The German think tank says that EU exports to the US would decline by between 15 and 17%, leading to a significant 0.4% contraction of the EU's economy. The US wouldn't escape unscathed, its economy would also contract by 0.17%, and the US may also face tit-for-tat tariffs from the EU. All of these issues add up. Trump is decrying Zelensky while suspending aid to Ukraine. Members of his administration have lambasted Europe and made it clear that the continent, where most NATO members are based, is no longer a priority. Trump is even threatening to harm the EU, which hurts NATO by extension, with tariffs. The US meeting with Russia without NATO or Ukrainian representatives is one more of multiple cuts that seem designed to hurt NATO. Perhaps de Bendern is right. NATO may be suffering from an autoimmune disease called the United States that is killing it from the inside. The question now is simple. Why does Trump seem to want to kill NATO? Trump has been a NATO skeptic for several years. Brookings pointed that out in 2017, noting that Trump had complained to European leaders about their countries not meeting NATO's 2% of gross domestic product or GDP spending on defense. That target is a recommendation rather than a hard rule, but Trump's first stint as president showed that the flow of money in NATO was always on his mind. Trump correctly identified the US as NATO's major power player and its strongest financial resource. His dissatisfaction with the other members could be seen as an effort to push them into spending what he believes they should. You could certainly argue that was fair. In 2017, the US accounted for 71.7% of NATO's combined expenditure, with only a handful of the group's members hitting the 2% of GDP target. The situation has changed since. In 2024, 23 of NATO's 32 members hit the 2% target, demonstrating that the organization's European members were taking defense spending seriously. You might think that this would lead to Trump softening on NATO. His criticism played a part in this increased spending, alongside the Ukraine war, which would make America's president happier during his second term, but it hasn't. Former President Joe Biden accused Trump of being anti-NATO in 2024. He said, "When America gives its word, it means something. When we make a commitment, we keep it, and NATO's a sacred commitment." Donald Trump looks at this as if it's a burden. Those comments come in the wake of Trump claiming he'd let Putin do whatever he wanted with NATO members that didn't pay their way, and it shows that the divide that's now threatening NATO existed in the US before Trump started his second term. Today, Trump ally Elon Musk is calling for the US to leave NATO. He's been joined in those calls by some Republican politicians, including Utah Senator Mike Lee. Trump also brought up NATO spending again just weeks before he took office. On January 8th, he claimed that NATO's GDP target should rise to 5%. Former Trump aide John Bolton believes this statement may be Trump's way of engineering America's NATO withdrawal. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense, Bolton told British outlet LBC. But I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out. That could be the death blow for NATO. A NATO without the US loses the majority of its nuclear deterrent, along with the support of the world's most powerful military. Perhaps what we're seeing, with all of Trump's recent actions, are his attempts to engineer America's exit from NATO. We don't know one way or the other yet. And that's the problem for the rest of NATO's members. As the BBC pointed out on February 26th, Europe's NATO members may no longer be able to rely on the US as the organization's anchoring power. As Chatham House European Programme Head Armida van Rij points out, the idea behind NATO was this all-for-one and one-for-all belief, and that's been broken. So if Trump is truly looking to break the NATO alliance, Europe has to come up with the answer to a vital question. What comes next? NATO won't disappear if the US cuts ties. However, it will be severely weakened, meaning its European members have to start doing more. Rio Terrace makes this point during the France 24 debate. "We have had tough times before, but one thing is clear. Whatever we do, Europe must do more," says Terrace. That is what American presidents, starting from Barack Obama, have said always, that Europe must take more responsibility and start to pay for its security. Terrace went on to point out that his country, Estonia, is already spending nearly 4% of its GDP on defense. However, the actual dollar amount isn't high due to Estonia having a small economy. NATO's other nations outside of the US, such as France, Germany and the UK, need to step up their spending to protect NATO in a future that may not involve the US. That may already be happening. On March 4th, EU President Ursula von der Leyen announced a new European defence package she called Rearm Europe. The five-step plan will see the EU make around $841 billion available for defence spending over the next 4 years. It'll do so by easing the Stability and Growth Pact, which limits how much EU member nations can spend on defence, in addition to making around $160 billion of loans available to EU members. Future steps include altering how the EU spends its budget, particularly when it comes to its cohesion policy programmes, and mobilising private capital via the European Investment Bank and the Savings and Investment Union. Not uncoincidentally, the $850 billion or so of defense spending this creates roughly matches what the US spends on its military annually. It's almost like the EU is planning to fill an America-sized gap in NATO. Beyond this spending, NATO's European members need to find a sense of unity in the face of Trump's policies. That may be tough. EU members often don't agree among themselves. De Bendern points this out to France 24, who says the summits being held and proposed by Macron are supposed to project unity. However, we've also seen Macron suggesting putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, a suggestion that outgoing Olaf Scholz is extremely cautious about supporting. There are so many questions to be asked first, she says. Would European countries want to go to Ukraine to help enforce a peace deal which is imposed upon us as Europeans by the Americans and Russians? Perhaps not. Zelensky wouldn't agree to such a deal anyway. As he said before, there can be no peace deal agreed upon without Ukrainian involvement. We are very, very far from knowing what we're going to see, De Bendern concludes. And she's right, Trump may not have killed NATO just yet. However, he's put the collective defense organization on high alert with his actions over the past few weeks. Talking to Putin without Ukrainian or NATO involvement may have prompted the conversation, but the reality is that Trump has been a NATO skeptic for many years, and to some in Europe, that might be enough for him to pull America out of the coalition in the future. If that happens, NATO's European members need to be prepared. If they're not, the autoimmune illness of the organization's internal division may be enough to finish NATO off once and for all. But what do you think about the state of NATO, both now and in the future? Is the organization on its deathbed, or do you think Trump will keep the US in NATO and is just pushing for less American involvement in Europe's affairs? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.